Leibhaftigkeit, and to people that are present virtually. I think that as the delegate for the research in the humanities here in Foscari, this is a very important moment for us. It is an important moment both because we return again in presence, and this is a great sign and a promising sign, I hope, for the future post-COVID pandemic. This is also a very important moment for us because we are unveiling a crucial, I would say, collaboration with the Max Planck Gesellschaft and with the Institute for the History of Science, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and Jürgen Rehn in particular, who I warmly thank for his collaboration and his support to many of our activities, our PhD in sustainable development and climate change included. So I think that this collaboration is very important for Foscari for at least a couple of very important actions we are going to pursue. The first one is giving our research an international scope. And this is a clear example of how we can do that. Secondly, this is a very important chance for developing a transdisciplinary research. And I think that this idea of transdisciplinarity is not only a key word, it is a real need in our times, because the issues we are going to tackle are very complex, and we cannot deal with them from a monological perspective. We need a multilateral approaches, and this is a clear example of that. Of course, Venice is, I would say, an exemplar case for this collaboration between the humanities and the so-called natural sciences. Even if when I use this term natural sciences, I'm always a bit embarrassed. I think that we should reformulate them, but this is an issue you will going to deal with in the future, I think. I would say that Venice is an exemplar case, is a gorgeous case of the strict intertwining between, let's say, physical constraints on the one side and cultural traditions, cultural meanings on the other side, between technical capacities, habits, customs on the one side, and natural circumstances on the other side, between, let's say, with a final formula between nature and culture. In the philosophy, I am a philosopher, and I can say that, as most of you know, in the current philosophical debate, we speak very, very often of cognition as action, of cognition as embodied practice, of cognition as material engagement. And I think that Venice is a terrific example of this way to do cognition, that is knowing by doing, by being materially engaged, by being embedded in an environment that is as well natural as much natural as well as cultural, and laden with deep history and significance. So one final consideration regarding a third pillar in Foscari strategy for the research in the humanities, and not only in the humanities. That is, I hope that the results of this 5 years collaboration can be possibly open access, can be possibly shared among the community of researchers, international researchers, that is broader, that is broader than Foscari and broader than the Max Planck Gesellschaft, even if both of them are very prestigious, important institution for developing sciences. We have to think that our goal is to go beyond our ivory towers and reach people and citizenship. So many thanks and have a good work.
Thank you very much, Roberta. Now it's Jürgen Wren who will deliver a welcome address. The ether is yours, Jürgen.
Thank you very much, Pietro. I hope you can hear me. Okay. Dear Pietro, dear Roberta Dreon, dear Matthias, Francesco, Tom, Babo, Klaus, all the people I see, dear colleagues and friends, I want to warmly thank you for your kind introduction, Roberta and Pietro in particular, and welcome to all of you to this truly joyous occasion. I'm very happy that today we are able to celebrate the inauguration of our partner group, headed by my close colleague and friend, Pietro Amodeo. And I have to admit that I'm rather sad about not being able to be with you in person today. Leibhaftig, as Roberta put it. But other than that, the setting for this inauguration could not be better. The Anthropocene Campus Venice is essentially a representation of the research theme of this partner group, as Pietro and Matthias will outline later on. In my introduction, I would like to explain the program itself a bit more and why, in my opinion, it is a very important instrument for forming and strengthening international scientific relations. I will also say a few words on why this partner group in particular is so significant in my view. First and foremost, I want to thank Ca' Foscari University, our partner in this group, for strongly supporting this project and for giving the partner group a home base. Without them, all of this would not have been possible. So let me introduce the concept of the partner group program. The Max Planck Society, the overarching institution for all Max Planck Institutes, has established this program in 1999 as an instrument to strengthen the ties to foreign researchers and research institutions by funding jointly conducted projects. These partner groups are always a joint project by an MPI and the home institution of a researcher and are set up for 5 years. The two main criteria, however, are that the director should be an early career researcher from abroad, from the perspective of Germany, who had previously spent a research residency at the Max Planck Institute, and that the researcher and his or her project are judged to be excellent, which I can only underline is truly the case here. Initially, the program was set up to build ties with scientific communities outside the Western Hemisphere, in particular in countries such as India or China. But this has changed over the years, and currently there are 2 calls per year. One is aimed at one country in particular, the other is an open call. Groups can be founded within all disciplines, though the so-called natural sciences are predominant. In total, there have been 216 partner groups since the program was launched. Currently, there are 99 partner groups worldwide, among them 23 in Latin America, 57 in Asia, 3 in Africa, and 16 in Europe. In Italy, there is only one, the one we are celebrating today. Italy, in that regard, has a very special scientific landscape and a country we at the Max Planck Society, but also in Germany in general, have close scientific ties to, and for very good reasons. Italy is a leading nation in many fields, as also the recently awarded Nobel Prize in Physics shows, but certainly it is the country where the most advanced research in the novel field of political epistemology is carried out. And this happens here at Ca' Foscari. Italy is also a country to which the Max Planck Society has long-standing and strong ties. 2 Max Planck Institutes are located here, both renowned research institutions with long traditions. Moreover, my own institute, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, has collaborated with Italian institutions since its very foundation in 1994. Let me just mention a few of these long-standing ties. With the Museo Galileo, the Opera del Duomo, and the Kunsthistorisches Institut in Florence, with the Biblioteca Hertziana in Rome, with the University of Urbino, and the Centro Internazionale di Studi Telesiani, Bruniani e Campanelliani in Cosenza. In all our collaborations with Italian institutions, and in particular also in our cooperation with the new partner group here in Venice, we are strongly supported by the Italian embassy in Berlin. They are great partners also for our Anthropocene project and have done much to make this campus event here in Venice come true. We began our collaboration with the Italian embassy in the context of our Leonardo project, which resulted in an exhibition at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, the State Library, as well as in an online exhibition, which you may still enjoy. This initial contact has turned into a close partnership that now also extends to other subjects, in particular the Anthropocene, jointly pursued with our close partner, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, and of course, the partner group. This finally brings me to my main topic, for which we have all gathered together in Venice this week, physically or virtually, the Anthropocene. About 10 years ago, my team and I began working on the Anthropocene. 2 workshops in 2012 to explore the nascent Anthropocene research with young scholars and scientists from various disciplines quickly developed into what is now an international research network. The many projects that are being carried out in this context are all connected through an umbrella project called the Anthropocene Curriculum, as you can see on its website, anthropocene-curriculum.org. And this happens with our principal partner in this context, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin. A main cooperation partner of the Anthropocene Curriculum is also the Anthropocene Working Group of the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy of the International Commission on Stratigraphy. The reason for why I stress this cooperation in particular is the recent Anthropocene Markers Workshop organized together with our partners that was actually, in my view, a milestone in Anthropocene research. The Anthropocene Working Group is currently engaged in an investigation to identify key anthropogenic signatures for the Anthropocene, an investigation that began in 2020 and will be finalized in 2022. For this, the group assesses the material evidence for a globally synchronous and lasting record of human activities on physical, chemical, and biological processes of the Earth system. Through the identification and dating of the lower stratigraphic boundary, the so-called Global Boundary Stratotype Section and Point, GSSP, traceable in various marine and terrestrial deposits, the group will consider a formal beginning of the Anthropocene, placing this new human-made epoch at the current end of a geological timescale that encompasses 4.5 billion years of geological evolution. So 2022 will be a very special year. Not only will the Anthropocene Working Group present the results of their GSSP investigation in May 2022, again at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin. Also later that year, probably in the fall, the partner group members will come to Berlin, and I'm looking very much forward to that, to present the results of their first year of project work, on invitation by the Italian embassy, who will host this presentation. The planned research of the partner group is indeed, and in many senses, complementary to that of other important research activities on the Anthropocene. As it will be particularly concerned with the role of water in the Anthropocene, let me only mention that in 2018 and 2019, we conducted, together with the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, a comprehensive study of the entire Mississippi River watershed as part of the Anthropocene Curriculum Initiative. Over the course of a year, this major project, called Mississippi, an Anthropocene River, explored how the river, as ecology and human habitat, has been reshaped over time, understanding its present as a product of a history of human environmental interaction, but also of violent intervention. The research carried out by the partner group will continue this path by analyzing the geo-environmental history of Venice as a paradigmatic case to study the interplay between culture and nature. The Venetian water civilization always had to negotiate its existence within the shifting boundaries of the sea and the land, and thus offers a unique opportunity to study the past in order to contribute to present debates on sustainability and climate change. More specifically, the project is a concrete study of a local setting from a global perspective, which will complement the existing work of the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science and its partner institutions worldwide on the Anthropocene. The recent developments at Foscari, just outlined again by Roberta Dreon, provide an ideal environment for this work, and I'm extremely grateful for that. It is, in other words, a wonderful opportunity to continue and expand the friendships and collaborations fostered by the Anthropocene Initiative. I will now pass on to my colleagues Matthias Schemmel and Pietro Amodeo, who will introduce the research carried out by the partner group. So thank you very much for your attention, and in bocca al lupo.
Yeah, thank you, Jürgen. Let me see if I can put this up a bit. Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to speak here at this inauguration event. Thank you, that's high enough. So what I will do, I will quickly outline our collaborative research out of which this partner group project grew. And then Pietro will go more into the details of the future work and perspectives of this group. So partner groups, as Jürgen just explained, are a framework for continuing and expanding collaborative research and research cooperations, and sometimes also refocusing them. So about 10 years ago, I headed a research group at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin on the longue durée development of spatial concepts. We called it the historical epistemology of space. So by historical epistemology, we understand a historical theory of knowledge, but also a theoretically informed history of science. And we focused on the concept of space because it's a fundamental category in human cognition and also in many theories of cognition. And at the same time, it's a crucial and central concept in many physical theories and cosmological theories. And the premise of the project was that these aspects of space, the crucial role in cognition, the crucial role in theory, they are not unrelated, but they are connected by developmental processes, be they individual processes, as in the project, in the process of growing up of each individual, but also in particular by historical processes, by the historiogenesis of our knowledge, and that they are in this way bound to each other. And these historical processes, which are various in different societies, they comprise things like practical knowledge on navigation through space, or the social and political control of spaces and of places that take place in each society. In some societies, they comprise a reflection, institutionalized reflection on knowledge, or they may comprise a long-term trend in the global history of knowledge that is the expansion of experiential spaces, of experiences about space, say from local experiences to more global ones, for instance, in a geographical sense. So this was the context in which our lasting exchange started, to begin with an exchange on the history of astronomy and on cosmology. And we focused at that time also on the early modern history. So Pietro was working on the cultural context and the reception of Copernican astronomy at the time. I had worked on Thomas Harriot, an English mathematician and contemporary of Galileo, whose work illustrates that the knowledge transformation in early modern times was not driven by geniuses, but rather was a collective process of knowledge transformation. So now in the context of this group, we refocus in a way from the heavenly realm to the more terrestrial one. So from cosmological space to geology and cosmography. And with this focus comes also an expansion of the idea of historical epistemology to what we call political epistemology. So in historical epistemology, you could say that we try to search for a foundation of knowledge in its genesis, in its historical development. Political epistemology highlights another aspect, that is the societal functions of knowledge and science, and the power of science actually to change the world in all dimensions, like the cognitive dimension, the material dimension, and the social dimension. And this world-changing power of science has become only too blatantly clear in the Anthropocene. And I think the relation there is very clear to everybody here. The idea of a political epistemology we have explored and tried to develop further in form of a political epistemology curriculum, together with Senthil Babu, who's also present here virtually, and Sascha Freiberg. And this joint work can serve as a foundation for the methodological part of this partner group work. I will now hand over to Pietro, who will describe in more detail the work and the perspectives of the group in the coming 5 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthias. It's very helpful that you introduced the methodological and philosophical framework. It is also part of the subtitle of the partner group, the Water City Political Epistemology of Hydrogeological Praxis. I'm not spending more words on the philosophical frame, but I'd like to pinpoint or to stress certain aspects, certain concrete aspects of the work that has been carried out and the work that we are envisaging for the next 5 years. So the Water City as a project takes Venice as a historical case that should be understood and read in comparative terms. So longue durée and comparative dimensions. That's something we already addressed in this campus, the Anthropocene Campus, Venice 2021. And this is a very important issue for the partner group too. Venice as a paradigm, as we heard already in the campus and this morning, to think of global processes. It is also an occasion for cross-disciplinary collaborations, very importantly so. Not only the natural sciences and the humanities, but really specifically the history of science, the philosophy of science, literary criticism, geology, cosmography, cartography, etc. So we will become concrete through pilot projects to specific projects that we are going to conduct. We look at global processes, as I said, from at least 4 perspectives: the environmental, which is the crux of the Anthropocene, the economic. We spoke on many occasions about how to include the economic, the societal dimension in the paradigm of the Anthropocene. The political, which is included in the concept of praxis, that is part of the mission of the project, and the cultural dimension, especially the scientific, the importance of science as a word transformative force, a cultural product that is transforming our world, and the symbolic dimension. By the symbolic, I mean the representations, narratives, perceptions at the level of aesthetics, for instance, of the arts, of literature. So I'll mention a few lines of research. First, environmental history. We'll take Venice as a point of departure. Environmental history, which has already been a topic on which I worked with Tina Asmussen and other of us. We already have a PhD in our Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage, together with Roberta Dreon, that will be fostered by the Water City project, and will be a project on the Anthropocene, environmental philosophy, environmental aesthetics. We also have another project, a PhD project on transcendental geology, so on the philosophy of the Anthropocene. This will give the breadth, broader horizons to the specific topics. Hydrogeological history in the longue durée will be our focus, if you like. With Senthil Babu, who's here online, we've been discussing for years and on how to compare the Venetian reality, its history, its present with southern India, especially the Kaveri Delta. And I'm very much looking forward to continuing discussing the historical, the political, the labor dimension of our cultural engagement with water, our legacy, and also the future of our societies. Omar Rodriguez from Mexico City has started digging the archives of Mexico City, looking for the traces, the documents, the history of another water city, Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, which is different and similar to Venice. And I really hope that the Mississippi project that has been part of the Anthropocene curriculum could be one more collaboration, not only a legacy from the past curriculum, but also something to construct together in order to have the Water City as a more solid project. So we look at hydrogeological histories, using that not only as an historical exercise, but also to consider with scientists what the advantage of historical materials can be for scientific research, for the earth sciences in particular. Many of us met Sebastiano Trevisani yesterday in Lido. With him, I'm considering the possibility to extract historical proxy data from sources, and that's something that cannot be achieved by one person. We need a group, we need people with different competencies, natural, scientific ones, geological ones, and historical ones. We're going to explore the state archives of Venice, which are full of fantastic materials for this collaboration. Economic and the political dimensions, as I stressed, are very important for the hydrogeological histories that we are telling, that we are reconstructing. Migration is also one of the topics I'd like to include. We referred many times on Brodel, his idea of the Mediterranean as a connecting watery space. We had a keynote by Florica Egmont stressing the idea of a water connection of the Nordic seas. And here we address also the topic of Venice as a crossroad of migrations today, not only yesterday. My colleague, the sociologist Francesco della Pupa, just finished a graphic novel that we are going to present tomorrow to a smaller group that deals with migration from Bangladesh to the Venetian area and from Venice to London. Just one case to look at the global economic connections of this place we are in. And I'd like also to mention the collaboration with Ifor Duncan on rivers as borders. So again, the political dimension of rivers today. And as I mentioned, the cultural contexts of science and the arts are very important. The question that Matthias already addressed of what science is produced by societal practices and how science is mobilized in our societies towards the transformation of our mentalities, of our societies, of the world surrounding us at a superficial and a very deep level too. Labor organization struggles, hegemonies, and counter-hegemonical moves should be part of the discussion about what science is as a cultural phenomenon. And in this context, I'd like to mention the collaboration with Klaus Vogel, who is now online, a historian of cosmography, that we are going to look in its development from early modernity in colonial settings in which the exploration of the world was not unrelated, as we all know, from political and economic agendas. So science in its political contexts, and cartography as an important element to complement geological considerations. The symbolic levels, narratives and representations of water, in particular of the Venetian water, but not only. The arts and literature should be included. Heiner Krellich is working on a political iconography of waterscapes, preparing an iconographic database for the project with maps, vedute, and symbolic representations of Venice. I'd like also to mention the collaboration with Daniel Finch-Reis on narratives of the hydropolis, as he calls it, as he calls Venice, the hydropolis Venice. So this should give you an idea of concrete projects and the scope of our engagement with Venice, starting from here and looking at a broader horizon. Before I pass the word to the next speakers, I'd like to mention one more project that connects Venice to Berlin, two edition open access series. Roberta addressed the importance of having, of disseminating, of being open to the world and being open access. Venice and Berlin already started two open access series. One is the Knowledge Hegemonies series, which looks at knowledge production and relations in the early modern work. Tina Asmussen is part of the project. Rodolfo Garau is also part of this project. And the second series, it's the Verum Factum series, deals with political epistemology. So it's more on the theoretical side. Matthias Schemmel is part of the project from the inception, just as Sasha Freiberg, and among those who are here, Senthil Babu and Giulia Rispoli. The project is already present on the web. So we have a website that will also be a reference point for the developments. With this, I conclude my introduction to the concrete work that we already started doing, and I leave the floor to scientific presentations. So thank you.
So we will have, two talks today, and the first is by Francesco Luzzini. Francesco is Marie Skłodowska-Curie Global Fellow at Foscari University of Venice and affiliate scholar of the Max Planck Institute of the History of Science in Berlin. He is also contributing editor for the ISIS bibliography of the History of Science and co-editor for the History of Science section of the journal Il Protagora. Francesco's research focuses mainly on the earth and environmental sciences, natural philosophy, and medicine in early modern Europe, with important forays into modern and contemporary contexts. His current Marie Curie project, Sounding the Depth of Providence, aims to understand how the debate on mineral generation in early modern Europe influenced the development of natural philosophy, the earth sciences, and the role of humans as geological and environmental agents. Francesco, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Thank you, Pietro. Thank you, Roberta, Jürgen. And it's terrific for me here to be both member of Foscari and of Department 1 of Max Planck Institute. It's like a sort of crowning moment for me. And with this presentation, I would like to provide an overview, absolutely non-exhaustive, but I hope useful, of the water management provided by the Republic of Venice throughout the century in 16 centuries of existence. I also have prepared a sort of a PowerPoint, but we had technical problems, so I hope you don't mind if I present with a PDF. It should be good enough. So, in 1715, the Venetian nobleman, mathematician, and hydraulic expert Bernardo Trevisan published a treatise entitled Della Laguna di Venezia, on the Venetian lagoon. Doesn't work. Can I move? What if I move here on? Can you hear me? No? Too much. I'm sorry. Trevisan, a mathematician and hydraulic expert, summarized and discussed, and in many cases criticized, the main actions taken by the Republic of Venice on the lagoon in order to preserve the balance between land and sea through the centuries. Such interventions included, for example, periodical draggings the creation of new channels, embankments, dams, and the diversion of rivers and torrents. We'll talk about this more extensively later. Both in the Dogado, which was basically the part of the Republic of Venice, which included the city itself and the lagoon, and in the so-called terraferma, which is basically the Italian mainland of the Dominion of Venice. Now, Trevisan, sure enough, treatise, sure enough, is quite relevant to our discussion today, but for now, I would like to just focus on the frontispiece of Trevisan's essay, which in my opinion is still nowadays the best description we have of the situation on Venice and how Venice dealt with this problem. Dealt with this constant struggle, if we can say so, between land and sea, in which neither opponent prevailed, nor was the interest of Venice that one of the two prevailed. So we must understand, in order to see Venice for what it is and what has been in 16 centuries of existence, that the main goal of this republic was to manage water so that none of the two opponents prevailed, so that both shoaling and the submersion of the lagoon were avoided. And in doing so, Venice, which was well aware of this fact, this point has been already addressed in some previous words that have been said, but in this sort of seemingly eternal conflict between land and sea, we see that in the end, how Venice dealt created a situation for which the artificial and the natural, of the human and the natural, if we can use the categories which I don't very much like, but I can use that for commodity, are so entangled to such a point that it's for sure, it's not hardly possible and useless for sure to treat them separately. So I will try to treat them all together, which is the case of Venice is somehow easy. Venice was well aware of this fact, and it was not by chance that in the early 16th century, it established the Magistrato alle Acque, Magistrate of Water, for waters, a powerful, very powerful administrative organ, magistracy or board of experts, responsible for water management in the Venetian lagoon. Main goal of this board of experts was to preserve the lagoon, whose existence was essential to the very survival of the Republic. A not obvious task, for, as we know, every lagoon, sooner or later, is bound to become land or sea. And these efforts were especially focused on two of the three parts of Venice, of the Venetian territory, which were the Stato da Mar, so the overseas territory, the Domini Terraferma, we have said is Italian interland, and the Dogado, which is Venice itself, sorry, with the lagoon. The prime consequence of this constant effort was that Venice throughout the centuries became a great hub for science, especially for hydraulic and earth sciences. And as a sort of talk about longue durée, it's a sort of long collaboration and long laboratory for science and interaction between different kinds of knowledge. Many different authors, now I have provided a very short list with what I consider to be the main ones, Sabatino, Castelli, Coronelli, Zendrini, Riccati, Galileo, who was here until 1610 in the University of Padua, and built, created an invention, a patent of a water pump, Geminiano Montanari, Ramazzini, and many others. So many dominant issues of hydrogeology and the earth sciences, as for example, water management, land management, the origin of springs, so the origin of fresh water and therefore of drinking water, were addressed here in the Republic of Venice. And it was here that the main efforts to understand the processes of nature were made. In 2010, the Foscari Venice, together with the University of Padua and Verona, organized in celebration of the 300 years of the establishment of the Giornale dei Letterati d'Italia, a congress. Giornale Letterati d'Italia was the first learned journal which appeared in Italy, devoted equally to the arts and science. And on that occasion, I focused on the earth sciences and simply made the measurements. I don't like metric very much, but this is quite significant in my opinion. I made the measurements of how many contributions in the different issues of the Giornale dei Letterati were devoted to the earth sciences. This is what I discovered. There was an absolute dominion of the earth sciences topics, both with respect to articles and essays published for the first time in the Giornale dei Letterati, and for book reviews, for example. And within this broad field, I found that there were many more than the others, for at least, if we exclude mineralogy, works devoted to hydraulics, hydrogeology, water management. This is not for, this is not by chance, of course. And in fact, Venice throughout its history had to deal with a lot of issues which were not focusing, not only focusing related to the lagoon, but also on the water management in the mainland, because rivers carried both water and sediments to the lagoon. And so we have a tangle of issues, the so-called sabbioni, the sandbanks, which were created by the deposition of sediments in the lagoon and created problems for navigation as well as for potential shoaling of the lagoon. We have flooding from rivers and torrents, which caused the destruction of wheat fields and could starve the population. We have a lot of sanitary problems, health problems, public health, public nutrition, social turmoil. And so it's a sort of complex context where if you touch a point, you can solve it, but maybe you can create problems in another point. And so the particular skill of Venetian experts through the century talk about collective enterprise. I totally adhere to the idea that science, much more the result of few geniuses, is the result of a collective and cumulative effort. I will provide some few examples now. The first one of the most significant in my opinion, is the Taglio di Portoviro, which was a really ambitious, unprecedented hydraulic and engineering work promoted by the Republic of Venice. So what was it basically? In order to prevent excessive transport and deposition of sediments in the southern part of the lagoon, close to Chioggia, the main branch of the Po River was diverted south, about 7 kilometers. This caused diplomatic issues with the Papal States, which fiercely opposed the project, and they were right, because this project created marshes in the Papal States, especially at the head of Ferrara, or some. But Venice made use of the fact that the Pope Clement VIII had declared a jubilee for 1600, he could not engage in war. So from 1600 to 1604, Venice performed this work. And the result was that the part of the lagoon which was being shoaled, which is the southern part of the lagoon, and this was caused by the fact that streams coming from the Apennines carry much more sediment than stream coming from the Alps. And so the lagoon tended to grow from south towards north. The course of the Po River, the main branch of the Po River was diverted south 7 kilometers. This is Taglio di Portoviro. And the result, new land was formed. Today, nowadays, through the centuries, we see that this part, which corresponds to the easternmost part of the province of Rovigo, the Polesine, is basically an artificial production of man. Okay. And this means something, in my opinion. And Pietro, Sebastiano Trevigiani, Bob already talked about the quarrel between the controversy of the management of the lagoon. We can talk here of a sort of clash of different knowledges. I mean, was the diversion of rivers useful? Benedetto Castelli, one of the most expert technicians when it came to hydraulics and mathematics, said yes. Said no, meaning that the more you let water to come into the lagoon, the more you preserve shoaling of the lagoon. In fact, he said that one of the problems was that the lagoon was being filled with sediment just because rivers were diverted. And there was a clash with the practical knowledge, if we can say so, of hydraulics engineers, even fishermen, who knew better the lagoon, his mechanisms on a hydrogeological level. And the Venetian authorities rejected Castelli's project significantly, I'll say. So we have political and social implications of this clash of knowledges. Another important point, in my opinion, is another case study is that of Vincenzo Maria Coronelli, a Franciscan friar, a cartographer, an official cosmographer, a great cosmographer of the Republic of Venice, who proposed to build a diversion channel to connect the Adige River, the very turbulent Adige River, the Esch, with Lake Garda on the west. This in order to prevent the turbulent river from flooding the plains of Verona and Polesine, which are this one of the lower course of the river, right? Now, it was problematic. It was problematic because following a debate among Venetian experts, the project was rejected. There were main reasons, and these were, it was definitely too expensive in an era when Venice were not doing very well when it came to money, especially in the 17th and 18th century. There was a risk of deterioration in the relations between the Republic of Venice and the neighboring territories, for example, the Duchy of Mantua, due to potential floodings caused by the Mincio River, which is the emissary of the Lake Garda. And so the project of Coronelli was rejected, but history, as we know, can be ironic. And so in 1959, following a heated debate again, the Italian Republic decided to realize the very same project, this time not as a channel, but as a tunnel. And the Galleria Adige Garda, the Mori Torbole tunnel, was built in 1959 and was met with a lot of controversy and is periodically used, especially when we have more and more frequent floods in the Adige course river and in the course of the Adige River, sorry. And the last time was about 3 years ago, I seem to remember. And this is significant too of how old knowledge, if we can call it old, as somehow a reflection of our present action and decisions and our discussions and debates. And of course, there's a connection between water and health, because managing water also meant managing drinking water. La città che è in acqua e non ha acqua, the city that is in water and has no water to drink. Started using groundwater only in the 19th century, according to the last researchers we have. Previously, the supply of drinking water depended on a complex system of storage and filtration of fresh water, the so-called pozzi, which in fact were more than pozzi, were tanks, that is cisterns built to collect rainwater and to store the fresh water carried from the mainland when the rains were not enough. I believe that David Gelticore already talked about this much more extensively than I can do now. And talk about water and that connection. Brackish water also meant brackish air. And in a period when, according to the Galenic theory of disease, bad smell causes the disease, there was another debate about whether or not Venice was healthy for the population. And this was not obvious because we see, this is a treatise I really do like. It's called Disinganno, ovvero ragioni fisiche fondate sull'autorità ed esperienza che provano l'area di Venezia interamente salubre. Disillusionment, so physical reason, proving the air of Venice completely healthy, 1694. In this treatise, the physician Lodovico Testi replied to the calumnies of those who aim to discredit the reputation of Venice and its lagoon. He provided all a series of a theoretical and practical reason, including experiments performed on animals, together with his friend Antonio Vallisneri. Let me talk about Antonio Vallisneri at least a bit now. In order to prove that the air of Venice and the water of Venice were not bad for the health of both animals and men and humans. And this was not just a medical matter. As affirmed, the salubrity of the air of Venice implied that the Republic itself was healthy. And moreover, it was able to safeguard the public health and safety of its population. So we have here a lot of social and political implications, of course. And finally, and this is something I really do like, another remark is that we go back to water management in the mainland, then fixing a problem in a point meant worsening or causing other problems elsewhere. This in turn triggered political, economic, and environmental and social issues, both within the Republic and between the Republic and the neighboring states. A clear example, eloquent I'll say, of this complexity is the old quarrel of the so-called Diversivo del Castagnaro, which opposed Verona, part of the Serenissima, let's remember, and the Duchy of Mantua to Venice. The Diversivo was a naturally formed and artificially reinforced drainage channel, which appeared in the 15th century following a flood. It drained the water from the Adige River and sent it into the Tartaro River, which ran through the so-called Valli Veronesi, which are the southern part of the nowadays province of Verona, and Mantua, okay? And this caused, of course, frequent floods in the plain region of Valli Veronesi, ruining harvests and consequently starving the population and causing diseases and epidemics. Still, the same diversion prevented the Adige River from flooding the eastern region of the Polesine, so the lower part of the course of the Adige River, which was part of the Republic of Venice, whose fields provided significantly wheat to the capital and significantly too belonged to the most part, for the most part at least, to the wealthy Venetian patricians who preferred to sacrifice a part of the population in Verona in order to have the wheat for them in Venice. And this is, in my opinion, another quite significant example of how water management also had strong implication on the social and political level. So to recap, throughout this long history, the Republic of Venice was bound to engage in a constant effort to deal with a constantly changing environment. In the unceasing stream of public and scientific philosophical debates which arose from and in turn shaped this effort, we find a tangle of issues which were mutually related and concerned hydrogeological challenges that we've seen, so water management, the mainland and the lagoon, climatic fluctuations. We must remember, we must know that Anthropocene debate and climate changes nowadays are not a novelty for the Earth, are a novelty for us, but even for us, for previous generations, I mean, we had climate fluctuations in the old times. For example, the climatic optimum of the Middle Ages in Europe, or the Little Ice Age in the following centuries. And of course, not to that extent as we now have at the global level when it comes to climate changes, but we must also consider that this phenomena caused significant outcomes on the population and environment of Europe, especially in Venice, which was so fragile when it comes to the equilibrium between imbalance between land and sea. We have issues related to public health, nutrition, and safety. Just think of epidemics, droughts, floods, the provision of drinking water, which we have seen was a constant concern for Venice, especially in face of a rising population, at least before the plague came. And we have, of course, concurring political, social, economic factors and implications. And finally, last but absolutely not least, we have the interaction of technical, practical, philosophical, scientific knowledges. There's an extra S there, but I'd like to point out this. And of course, artistic knowledge too, and literary knowledge. Encounter, confrontation, and more or less fertile and more or less serene debate about knowledges. And in my opinion, this sounds quite familiar to us because I think that although on a smaller scale, we have here the same tangle of issues that we are facing today at a global level.
So the history of water and lagoon management in Republic of Venice, and I shall finish now, I think it can teach us a lot on the approach to adopt when facing environmental and climatic challenges. For example, an approach which, as we have seen, is not necessarily supposed to be natural to be good. In fact, Venice and its beauty have survived for so long, precisely because the Republic learned how to adapt to a mutable environment, preserving artificially, therefore unnaturally, and at a great cost, a landscape which was bound to disappear by shoaling or submersion, turning, respectively, into land or sea. Yes, as the history of Venice shows, unnatural does not necessarily mean bad for the environment or for us. I think flexibility was and is the key for us. This concept is valid for Venice as well for our global community nowadays. And let me add a sort of final personal and naive touch. Besides, I think that insisting more, even on a political level, on this point will help us to break the many ideological gridlocks and views that pose a serious threat to the evolution of the Anthropocene debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesco. You can stay there. We have time for questions if there are questions from the audience, also maybe from our online colleagues and friends. Anybody has questions? Maybe raise your hand if you do have. Oh, you have a question. I'm not sure if Jürgen, does Jürgen want to say something? No.
No, just that this was a great talk.
Perfect. Thanks, Francesco. I'm from a history of science perspective, I'm wondering if you open a textbook on the history of hydrology, it's France that figures, it's Pierre Perrault, and it's this story about the history of hydrology as a science that emerges. And the cases you gave are very much applied cases. And I wonder, was there like a basic science of hydrology that emerged in a Venetian context?
Sorry, my hearing is really bad. Can you repeat?
Sure.
Because,
the whole question?
I listened until Perrault and then I lost the
Essentially, the question is, was there a kind of basic science of hydrology that emerged in the Venetian context rather than an applied science?
Yeah, sure. Of course, now I insisted more on Venice, but we must also remember there was a constant connection between hydraulics in Venice and the rest of Europe. You mentioned Perrault, should also mention Mariotte, Edmond Mariotte, for example, with the Académie Royale de France, sorry. And we must also remember, in fact, that when the growing debate of hydrogeological problems and of the origin of springs, which was a major issue those times, especially 17th and 18th century, became dominant, we have a strong interaction between, for example, one of the protagonists of this debate, who was Vallisneri, and the Frenchman. They were constantly mentioned in the publications. And another point was Edmond Halley, for example, who was one of the first to theorize and describe a sort of a hydrogeological cycle. He had to somehow prevent himself from publishing immediately because there were some problems with the censorship at those times, because some of this consideration touched somehow the biblical story. So yeah, absolutely, there was a connection and there was a constant relationship between these knowledges.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. I recently moved in an apartment next to the Adige, so hearing that it's very impetuous and wild freaks me out a little bit. But my question is, many of the scholars that you were mentioning in your talks were actually professors at Padua, I think, right?
Oh, yeah.
So my question would be, was there a direct political mandate or influence in the way that in a certain way directed the interest in this kind of studies?
Yeah, also in choosing the professors in Padua. Padua in the 17th century on purpose choose to favor and to hire a professor coming from a Galilean context and from experimentalist context as a sort of opposition with Rome, in a sense, even to Bologna after. And in Bologna, then we have the Galilean legacy, insisting more on the biological level. In Padua, we have Ramazzini, we had Galileo itself, and then we have Vallisneri, and then we have Trevisan, we have many other scholars, not just university professors, who were bound politically to the Riformatori dello Stato di Venezia, who were those charged to choose the professor. So choosing a professor also followed reasons which depended on whether or not this professor would have been useful to the management of the lagoon. Absolutely, there was a connection in this. I hope it was exhaustive enough.
Okay, thank you. No further questions. Then we proceed to the next presentation, which is by Thomas Turnbull. Maybe we thank our speaker again. Before we do that. And now we come to Thomas Turnbull, who's a geographer and historian who sometimes describes himself as an energy historian. He's interested in the relationship between the imperatives of thermodynamics and their relation to politics and the human sciences in the 19th and 20th centuries. He's a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, where he is a member of the Anthropocene Formation Group. With the support of this group, he recently helped organize a large-scale and transdisciplinary analysis of the Mississippi River Basin, an account of which will soon appear in the Anthropocene Review. Tom, the floor is yours. I might lower this a little.
In the meantime, I'll just thank Pietro for inviting me to give this talk. And I took the talk as an opportunity to read a book that I've been meaning to read for a long time, which is Braudèl's Mediterranean. So in this talk, I'm going to kind of expand the scale of analysis from Francesco's talk to the Mediterranean as a region and what Braudèl called the Mediterranean world. As Matthias mentioned, I'm a geographer by training, and what I find fascinating about Braudèl is the degree to which his work is grounded in the work of late 19th century and early 20th century geographers. And what I'm going to try and do is talk about Braudèl and this notion of the longue durée at the present historical moment, or at the present geo-historical moment. And to do that, I'm going to go on a little detour, perhaps, into more contemporary policy discussions and more contemporary discussions within the earth sciences, within geology. Thank you. So in 2008, the term water, energy, food, and climate was added to the term nexus. And this term became the mantra of the World Economic Forum. Those self-nominated guardians of sustained economic growth who meet in Davos in January every year. Its 1,000 members include groups such as the Worldwide Fund for Nature, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, and Nestle. So since this report, the World Economic Forum has described itself as an advocate of what they call global water governance. Note the term governance, a word that recognizes the growing influence of unelected and non-sovereign authorities in the domain of hydrology. So, okay, I'll lean over when I need to change the slide. Grazie. Okay, thank you. So in his book, so since the report, the World Economic Forum has described itself as an advocate of global water governance, and the organizations within it have nominated themselves as the corporate guardians of Earth's hydrological cycle and the many processes connected to its cycles of evapotranspiration. To its many cycles of evapotranspiration and precipitation, and its similarly vital material cycles of erosion, material transport, and deposition. And of course, the ecosystem services that moving water provides Earth's biota, particularly its humans, whose industrial ecology makes use of water for both transport, the dilution of pollutants, and the distribution of waste heat. So, in his book, Water, Abundance and Scarcity in the Age of Humanity, the geographer Jeremy Schmidt describes the World Economic Forum's adoption of the term water, energy, food, climate nexus as a sign that the self-nominated thought leaders have begun to recognize the binding constraints that limit the global supply chain on an Anthropocene Earth. Schmidt takes the World Economic Forum's adoption of this term as a sign that the organization no longer considers water as simply a cheap input into the production of carbonated drinks and processed foods. It's much more, it's the great interconnector between various earth-making processes. It's quite fair to see this all as a case of letting the fox loose in the hen house. But Schmidt argues that these water-intensive and polluting companies are indeed looking to securitize and protect their commercial interests. But in doing so, they've adopted an approach not dissimilar to that of the planetary boundaries approach proposed by Earth system scientist Johan Rockström and others. Like such scientists, the World Economic Forum poetically described planetary hydrology as, I quote, a gossamer, a thin, delicate web that links planetary hydrology to risks of flood, energy, climate, and financial collapse. So the terms gossamer and nexus emphasize the growing interconnections of a growing and increasingly technologized population and the relations they've established within the planetary system. However, history shows such interconnections have always been there, but recently, from around 1950 onwards, the scale, speed, and of course, impacts of these changes have increased markedly. What's all this got to do with history? Such interconnections are readily apparent in Fernand Braudel's The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II. This 2-volume, 600,000 word and 1,200 page epic is a love letter to the region, written while Braudel was a prisoner of war in Mainz and in Lübeck in the 1940s. As Pietro mentioned in his introduction earlier in the week, Braudel cast Venice as the epitome of this region, the focus of all its character refined through the Adriatic. For Braudel, Venice was a mysterious amphibious society, half land, half water, neither wholly Western nor wholly Eastern, beholden to neither Rome nor Byzantium. Sat between Europe and Asia and Christianity and Islam, its geography at the top of the Adriatic Channel allowed the city to make full use of the watery gossamer that allowed Venetian ships to traverse a vast interconnected system of human and environmental relations. The book starts with an account of the geological structure of the region, the tectonic folds and activated sediment cycles that resulted from the crumpling of the Earth's surface around 700 million years earlier. This activity formed the crest of mountains from the Alps to the Anatolian mountains that crown the Mediterranean Sea. To begin to explain the consequences of this vertical and subaquatic geography for the humans who have made this place their home, Braudel turned to a strange and largely forgotten facet of this economy, the snow trade of the 16th century. So quite amazingly, there was once a busy trade in snow, pieces of ice and iced water, all were shipped throughout the 16th century Mediterranean. Braudel describes how from Tripoli to Madrid, compacted mountain snow could be purchased even in the height of summer. In 1553, the French naturalist Pierre Bellon described boatloads of snow arriving in Istanbul from the Bursa Mountains, all to slake the thirst of the Turkish army. In Naples, a snow tax was even considered, given its popularity, while a 16th century Venetian noted how Syrian Moors sprinkled snow on their food as if it were sugar. Braudel even explained Italians' skilled gelato making as a consequence of this peculiar historical geography. Whatever the season, the region's high altitude mountains were connected to a network of navigable waters, which allowed melting ice to be harvested and sold. Seen in energy historical terms, in transporting melting ice across the Mediterranean, humans sought to impose order and derive use from this region's entropic processes. Water was central to Braudel's theory of history. Less than 300 pages of this epic book actually discuss Philip II. More than anything, the book describes the environment in which the Spanish monarch would briefly rule. The longue durée approach sought to explain human history as an epiphenomenon of its geography, those structural and material realities of the environment that both enable and constrain human history. Put in his own words, Braudel sought to explain man in his relationship to the environment, a history in which all change is slow, a history of constant repetition and ever-recurring cycles, an almost timeless history. That qualification, I think, is important. The longue durée is the perspective of the very long term. It's a history in slow motion. The hydrological cycle was one of these ever-recurring cycles which conditioned human history. In an early chapter of the book, he describes the back-breaking labor, the draining and the canalizing of the alluvial wetlands of Lombardia and the Po River basins, the transformation of them from malaria-infested peripheries of the Roman Empire to productive plains for growing wheat, rice, olives, and vines. Braudel called this Italy's internal colonization, a process involving the near enslavement of exploited seasonal workers, a true proletariat. Braudel mapped out the seasonal cycles of transhumance that gave dynamism to the region, the grazing animals that were led from desiccated areas to pasture in accordance with patterns of rainfall. But for Braudel, both humans and their animal companions were like sediment, traveling downstream in cold months and then heading upwards in dry summer months like evaporating water. He described the tramping trading boats which cruised around like traveling bazaars, and the fishing fleets that traced arcs from town to town along the coast. Braudel argued that the Mediterranean's bathymetry, the depth of its waters, meant there were few areas of moderate depth in which submarine life could flourish. He described its waters as geologically too old, as compared particularly to the North Sea. This somewhat sparse marine biogeography, Braudel argued, had geopolitical consequences, as, and I quote, "The scarcity of fish explains the scarcity of fishermen, and consequently that of sailors, which he argues always acted as an unseen brake on the grand projects of Mediterranean powers." Braudel's sense of the Mediterranean world far exceeded mere maritime geography. It was the region's shared climate that provided physical unity to the area. Dry and hot air blew upward from Africa, the Sirocco wind, while the wet and cool Bora and Mistral winds came southward from the mountains. Meeting in the middle, the true unity of the Mediterranean was demarcated by the northern limit of grapevine farming and the ability to grow palm in the south. This shared climatic zone created a shared rhythm of life across a vast expanse of land, and it gave unity to the coming and goings of an event-filled human history. So the hydrological cycle and the climate cycles of which it is part, and the slow processes of geological change that result from these cycles, are the foundations of longue durée forms of historical explanation. The problem was that just as Braudel's book was reaching a public audience in the 1950s, the almost timeless stage upon which human history took place was changing. Geology was, in a sense, becoming a human science. Braudel wouldn't have been surprised. History, he wrote, generally escapes the awareness of its actors. So what was happening? Just last year, a different type of historian, a geologist, Jaya Savitsky, and her co-authors argued that in the year 1950, just as Braudel's reviewers were praising his book and its account of an almost timeless geohistory were roughly, according to the data these geologists had gathered, experiencing this, occurring in the same year that extraordinary increases in the human use of energy had begun, and that this increase in energy use was closely correlated with dramatic increases in global population and economic and energetic productivity. Vast increases in the production of hydropower, plastic, copper, cement, ammonia, and carbon dioxide followed. This improved the lives of many and enriched a few individuals to such an extent it would have made even the most opulent Venetian blush. But at what cost? The almost timeless cycles of hydrology, climate, and geology that Braudel saw as the preconditions of human history, the geological superstructure that provided the ever-recurring cycles of natural and human history, were seemingly coming to an end. So, about the Mediterranean, Braudel wrote that the sea itself is the greatest document of its own existence. So if we were to fire a core sampler into today's Mediterranean, the layers of sediment retrieved would bear witness to the warming of the atmosphere and of the oceans. It would tell of their growing acidity and their decreasing biodiversity. There might even be new sedimentary layers containing traces of microplastics and the tiny spheres of carbon that rain down on Earth like Lilliputian meteors, byproducts of the uneven geography of fossil fuel combustion. With the aid of isotope analysis, we might even be able to identify a plutonium signal, the telltale sign of humanity's most damning 20th century conflict. This planet-wide trace radiation, a sign of the early tests of the first atomic bombs, arguably helped bring the Second World War to an end, a burst of energy that in some sense freed Braudel from prison. But if all of these marked planetary changes began to be registered around the same time as Braudel regained his freedom, perhaps the possibility of writing longue durée history was coming to an end, just as Braudel's readers were learning of such a thing. In an Anthropocene Earth, the longue durée has become perhaps a mere conjecture, or perhaps even histoire éventement. So, to follow the early modernist Erin Maglaque, who has recently pointed out that Braudel would not have been surprised by his own misunderstanding of his own geological moment. He strongly doubted his and humankind's ability to understand their own historical context. He thought one's historical reality could only be understood as it came to an end, or as Hegel said, the owl of Minerva takes flight only as night falls. This all takes us quite far from the banalities of the World Economic Forum, but the problem is the same one faced by Braudel. How can control or understanding be imposed on an Earth system that has exceeded the known bounds of its own operation? How can we begin to understand the planetary nexuses of water, food, energy, and climate, or the specific geographies of places like the Mediterranean, when the known conditions of cycles of carbon, nitrogen, and particularly water have fundamentally changed? The task is urgent and challenging. And I wish all power to the new partner group, and I wish them great success in unraveling both the hydrogeological past and its radically alternative future.
Thank you, John. We have 5 questions here. Thank you, Tom. So thank you for the whole presentation and the insights you brought. Let's continue a conversation that we had in the last days on Braudel, the connection between geography, economy, and culture, this sort of nexus. There is another Braudel, the Braudel of the history of capitalism and material life. So let's start thinking together how that Braudel connects to the Braudel of La Méditerranée. Where is the place of capitalism in this? Sorry, I mentioned this because Brodel has his own way of addressing the history of capitalism, but it seems to be a sort of rupture in the societal organization in history. So the question is, first, we can ask us together, where is the place we can put this economical discontinuity in this long-lasting, slow-motion development of history, making use of his own instruments? And second, connected to this, your last remarks on the Anthropocene reversing of certain considerations, given that we have to deal with a different geology. So what does it imply to have a different geology in terms of the longue durée analysis that Brodel offered us? It seems that, so again, a question, if in Brodel we have a sort of emergence from geology to economy, up to the high realms of politics and culture, we have here a sort of reversal feedback move in which science becomes the motor of societal transformation, technological and economical, and eventually geological. So yeah, that's the context of.
Yeah, thank you, Pietro. Regarding capitalism, in the first instance, I think what comes across both in the Mediterranean and Brodel's writings on capitalism is the continuity of something approaching a liberalized form of capitalism, so free trade between trading nations in the Mediterranean and beyond. And I think that's why people within the Annales school, particularly of a more strongly Marxist orientation, were somehow both enthralled to Brodel because he was so strongly historically materialist, but the political consequences that followed from his own materialism led him to a sort of defense of a liberal form of capitalism. So I think there's a somehow an interesting tension there. What I think is perhaps consequential for the vision that I outlaid, and I think the conversation that we have had and will continue to have, is this idea that the Anthropocene generally is seen as an event that requires some form of non-market intervention. Brodel himself was quite critical of the idea that the state should intervene in the market. So I think there's a sort of tension in the political epistemology underlying the notion of Brodel that needs to be unearthed and needs to be discussed more fully. With regard to your question about the relationship between geology and political authority or political decision making, I think that's why I like this example of the lack of fish leading to a lack of fishermen, and this leading to a kind of relatively paltry naval system which constrains the ambitions of rulers in the Mediterranean. I think this is real kind of classic geographic environmental determinism. It's saying that the conditions of the environment condition human history, condition human behavior. The distinction in an Anthropocene Earth, I think, it is the wealth of knowledge that we have about how our behavior impacts upon the Earth system. The geographer Élisée Reclus, the anarchist French geographer, described humanity as Earth becoming conscious of itself. So we are Earth's consciousness. And on the basis of that, we are now able to intervene in the evolution or the co-evolution of humans and the planetary system. And I think that's a great responsibility, and one that necessitates some kind of recognition from political decision makers, perhaps beyond the kind of self-nominated political decision makers of the World Economic Forum. I think it's something that needs to have some kind of democratic basis behind it.
Thank you, Tom. It was a very interesting presentation, and in general, I've really enjoyed hearing about this new project launch. I have a sort of two-part question, but they're related. The first part, I think, is could you say something about modes of thought that have developed since Brodel, and how you think a thinker who had the similar interests to Brodel might use those? I suppose I'm thinking particularly of for example, Donna Haraway is someone we've mentioned in passing a few times, but without really kind of engaging with very much. That kind of cyborg thinking that originally is about individual bodies, but then Matthew Gandhi takes it and makes it about cities, and he has written on water cities as well. So that's sort of part one is, I suppose, is there, in the last few decades, are there traditions of thought emerging that might help us reconfigure the kinds of ways that Braudel is thinking, and might that offer new ways of interpreting the history that he is telling? And then the second question is about bodies within these systems, because we're talking a lot about human impact on the environment, but of course this comes through individual behaviors and processes and practices and engagements with water. Or, you know, we were talking last night about how the consumption of fish, for example, involves the transfer of the type of pollutants that go into the water, become concentrated in the fish, and then they are concentrated in the bodies of other fish who eat the fish, and then people eat those fish, and then they're concentrated in them. And I just wonder if there isn't, in this kind of fairly structural way of thinking, do we risk losing sight of the bodies, which might be human bodies or water bodies or animals or whatever? Do we risk losing sight of that if we're always thinking in sort of geographical scales? I'd love to hear your thoughts on those.
Yeah, thanks, Samuel. Jürgen will laugh probably, because I tend to always be banging the drum for 19th and early 20th century geographers. And so I see things like post-humanism and Donna Haraway's work and environmental history and environmental humanities somewhat as the rediscovery of ideas that were common parlance and geography in that period. One of my favorite kind of demonstrations of that is the slightly controversial geographer Friedrich Ratzel, who's infamous for the invention of the idea of Lebensraum, living space. But he was also somehow a kind of avant la lettre Earth system scientist. And he was very concerned with how incoming solar energy created life on Earth. And he described humans as the ultimate hybrid beings. They were half human and half solar. They were put in motion through this influx of incoming solar radiation on Earth's surface. So I really think that this, I'm heartened by people like Haraway that have reintroduced this notion of hybridity into understanding of human-nature relations. But I think it's somehow old news, but I'm happy to see it again. With regard to the question of bodies, I think that's a really fascinating question. I think for Braudel, he was somehow a bit like Niklas Luhmann or someone like that, in that he had a very low opinion of individuals' autonomy and their agency over their own body, and somehow reflected in Peter Haff's work about the technosphere, where he argues all our busy activities in our lives and all the effort that we put into our lives and comings and goings and raising families from an Earth systems perspective is we're just acting as kind of corollaries of the maximization of the entropy of the system. And Braudel is curiously like this as well. He has a very kind of a very kind of strong opinion about the lack of human individuals' agency over their own life. And he sees humans as buffeted by geological forces and geographical forces. And the kind of comings and goings of histoire eventement are merely just kind of coincidences that occur as a result of these wider structural environmental forces. There's a nice kind of critique of that, particularly by the anthropologist Olivia Harris, who points out that by looking at Braudel's time in prison and his prison notebooks, the degree to which this longue durée perspective was a kind of psychological salve for him while in prison. It gave him a kind of escapism and a way of looking beyond the kind of humiliations of everyday prisoner of war life. And I think that's a nice kind of demonstration of the way in which subjectivity can be folded into his own argument in a historiographical way.
Thank you, Tom, for the presentation. As you put the hydrological cycle very at the core of your presentation, I was wondering, how do you think that the discussion that we are having today interact with critiques such as the one of Jamie Linton, that the hydrological cycle is, well, in very simplified way, a northern construct that is quite at odds with how many people on the world experience water?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think there's been a really interesting historicization of the hydrological cycle in only the last 5-6 years in the work of Jamie Linton and Jeremy Schmidt. And Jamie Linton in particular argues that the hydrological cycle as a kind of object of knowledge is closely connected to the New Deal era hydrology in 1930s America, and the identification of the hydrological cycle as a perpetuum mobilium, which would allow, suitably harnessed, the US to kind of continually extract power, hydroelectrical power from the system. So there's a kind of a commodification or a fetishization of water as a resource, which, as you quite rightly point out, in many societies, this kind of utilitarian approach to water is completely horrendous, and water is considered a sacred object. And when we were working in the Mississippi region, we learned that the surface of water is often considered a liminal space between the spirit world and the physical world. And so I think, yeah, so the hydrological cycle is of a particular historical moment. I think it does describe the circular processes that occur within the hydrological system, but I think it needs to be something that's communicated with sensitivity and awareness that this is a situated perspective on what hydrology consists of.
Thanks, Tom. Very, very shortly. This is the second time in 2 weeks that we hear the concept of a cyclicity of time cycle. I refer to the map of the Mediterranean and Brodel's comments, and I was wondering how's this conception of a time cycle as opposed to the directionality of time influence Brodel's theories and
Yeah, thank you, Francesco, for the question. There's always an important qualification when Brodel talks about, he talks about an almost circular history, an almost history of cycles. It's always qualified, and that's because he is grounded in an understanding, in a conventional understanding of geological change over time. And it's quite interesting, when I was looking at the geologist he cites, he was obviously reading quite outdated geology because he was in prison in Lübeck at the time, and he was only able to use the Lübeck Public Library for its research. So he's reading geologists from kind of early 1900s who essentially extend Charles Lyell's understanding of geological time, which is a linear, unidirectional understanding of geological time, and that feeds into his understanding of human history and this idea that civilizations tend to rise and fall, and that this kind of cycle, this natural cycle, is as common to natural systems as it is to human systems.
Okay, thanks. First of all, thank you for all this very important information. I'd like to, if I can, make a zoom out and try to broaden, put on the table some things that you might reject or discuss. I was very fascinated by one of the sentences you said. I hope I wrote it down exactly, which is, we should, the Mediterranean is the best witness of its own history, right? Did you say something like this? Or, okay.
Brodel said it.
Okay, yes, okay. And so let's try not to be so much historians or geographers or something else, a bit more Anthropocene. You can see if
such a witness is so crucial for us. How could we possibly give voice to that? Are we sure that all the tools of investigations we've been using so far, which are many, accurate, deep for sure in history, still keep on continuing, be effective, be useful for what the type of history, for the new type of information that we would like to extract for the Mediterranean itself? And around this, the zoom out is the following. I think, also referring to other things which have been said, that, okay, ideas in our ideas producer organ keep coming and going through the history, right? Like in a cyclical thing. So there are ideas which might have emerged at some time in history, and for some reason they sank, they disappeared. Nobody spoke about them. I mean, all of us scholars in something know about these processes of disappearing of very good ideas that at some stage, for some reason, pop up again, somebody picks them up, rephrase them, relocate them somewhere else, and they make use, all of a sudden, they become useful, mainstream, political, or revolutionary. So I wouldn't, turn down the relevance of some idea which pops up again all of a sudden, even though it's been said before by somebody else. I mean, we've been using system thinking, for example, so much in Anthropocene set of tools. Okay, system thinking and complexity. I mean, these are 70 years old tools, right? Out of computer sciences in the 50s, we started dealing with big data problems and complexity theory. But they are useful now because we are in a different world. We need those ideas now to understand that place now, today, with this new shaping, new reassembling of strategies. A research strategy is always a temptation, an attempt of collage, of bricolage type of work, of putting together what has been already said and maybe something new, maybe something with new connections. So in this sense, how could we make the Mediterranean speak?
Yes, thank you for the question. I was kind of heartened and I'm excited by the research agenda that Pietro outlined, because there will be collaboration, and there has been collaboration between historians and geologists, and seemingly there'll be the use of evidentiary sources that geologists use, which is why I showed this core sample in my slides. This essentially a core is, perhaps I should explain, is a metal tube fired into the Earth's surface or the surface of the ocean, and you pull out a plug of Earth, which shows the laminations, the layers of the sedimentary cycle over many thousands of years, depending on the length of the core. So that to me is a clear demonstration of how you could let the Mediterranean speak. Rachel Carson, before she wrote her famous book, Silent Spring, wrote a book called The Sea, where she describes the history of core sampling. And she describes what she calls the eternal snowfall of a sedimentary cycle. So this incessant cycle of material, and it's falling to the bottom of the ocean, and it's forming of layers. And this is able to tell us about the temperature of the sea, about the biodiversity, and so on. And for her, she tells this as, she describes this as the greatest saga that can ever be told. Obviously, it needs a human intermediary. It needs a geologist who is able to decode these layers and what these layers mean about the Earth system at that point in time. What geologists, I think, need from time to time is someone to then communicate that to a wider audience, because they're specialists. And through our work with the Anthropocene Working Group, as Jürgen mentioned, we've come into close contact with many geologists, but it often requires us as historians or human scientists to sort of reiterate back to them and to a wider public why this is such an amazing source of historical understanding, why this is a archive that shouldn't just be analyzed by geologists, it's an archive of interest to everyone. So that would be my idea as to how the Mediterranean can speak. Questions? Okay, then let's thank
So thank you, Tom. Thank you all. Thank you, Matthias, for chairing this session. Thank you all who are here in presence and also those who are online. Thank you, Jürgen, Klaus, Babu, and thank you, Roberta, for the nice words this morning. So we can start working on the Water City project. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Pietro.
Thanks.
Bye now.